Volunteer work was one of my favorite therapy back when I was in college. I often work on the streets, sweeping or helping elderlies cross the road. Sometimes, some of my relatives would call me to take care of their pets or children. But there was this one particular request that I would never forget. One day, a friend of mine who was also a volunteer called for my help to fill in for her for a month. Her mother got into an accident. Unlike me, she stays in one place for a whole year and volunteers as a caretaker for an orphanage outside of town. I've heard of the orphanage she was volunteering for. People often stay away from there because of its dark history. Some people say the place used to be a graveyard for unnamed and unwanted babies. Some say the place was where many unwedded women would take their own lives. In reality, no one really knows its history, and the orphanage had been there long before I was born. It was Sunday morning when I arrived at the orphanage. I expected a warm welcome from the nuns and the kids, but the place was almost derelict. I stood in front of the main gate and couldn't help but notice that the gate was rusted to the core, as if it's long been unattended. What's more, the orphanage sits right in the middle of a forest. I had to specially request a cab to take me here, despite his strong disdain of the idea. "Be careful," the driver said as I climbed down from his vehicle. "That place, it's cursed." The gate was unlocked, so I helped myself in. It creaked ever so loudly as if I was a star in a horror movie who's about to go to a place of no return. Upon entering, a long walkway adorned with tall grass hedges guided my way towards the main building. I also noticed a large bird bath installed in the middle, like a fountain. The main building was no worse than the gate. Sure, it looked really old, but I bet those oak wood frames supported the orphanage for many decades now and are still standing strong. The building was extremely magnificent, if you don't mind some crawling vines here and there. Old and magnificent. I walked slowly as I searched with my eyes, occasionally glancing behind me as the stark silence made me anxious. Eventually, I finally found someone. Another caretaker, perhaps. She was silently wiping a window by the side of the building. I was about to talk to her when she suddenly stopped wiping and stared at me. Her eyes were dilated and almost lifeless. I gulped my words and just went into the building. Fortunately, it was unlocked. That caretaker, or whoever she was, must be really tired. Just like the outside, the inside looked abandoned, with no one in sight yet again. I sighed as I sat on one of the long tables in the hall. I set my bag down and tried to relax. I was probably freaking out because of all the baseless rumors I heard about this place. I scoffed at myself. What was I even thinking? This is a place where orphans are being cared for. Why would such a wonderful place hold such darkness? When I cleared my head, I was able to see how wonderful the place really was. The main building was well lit inside because of all the large skylights and, of course, the large sliding windows on both ends of the building. I think they're more of a door rather than a window. I also noticed that they have closed jalousie windows across the entirety of the building, which was very uncommon to see even in a wealthy household. The furniture choice was wooden, but they were all majestic antiques that feature woodwork at their finest. Even their long tables were adorned with intricate carvings along their apron. The chairs, though small, all had similar styles to the two long tables. I imagined the place would also be well lit even in the evening because of all the pendant lights that looked like small strobe lights. The only thing was they were white. After carefully looking at the interiors, I stood up. I went to open one of the jalousie windows to let a cool breeze in. I almost fainted in shock when I opened one. The caretaker earlier was right there, peering through the window, staring at me intently. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. Aliena, she's my friend," I said, trying to calm myself down. "I'm here to fill in for her, didn't she tell you?" "Everyone went to church," she flatly replied. "They'll be back after lunch." And with that, she left. I called Aliena right then and there to make sure that I was welcome here and that the nuns were aware that I would be filling in for her. To my utmost disbelief, there was zero signal on my phone. I tried different locations already but had no luck at all. After lunch, the nuns and the children finally came back. The children all looked like Madeline with their yellow uniform and matching yellow beret hat with a blue ribbon pin placed on the top right of the hat. The children were instructed to put their belongings back in their rooms, and one of the three nuns offered me a full tour of the orphanage. We first went to the caretaker quarters, a series of quaint houses not far from the main building. The nun told me that it was a custom to give private housing to each individual in the orphanage. Hence, the private room for every child, private quarters for the nuns, and private housing for all the caretakers. I thought it was Ghastly. It must have been. But this place was built decades ago. The founder must have given this place a lot of thought. As the nun was giving me a tour, I noticed we passed by a building which she didn't acknowledge. I waited for us to pass the building again, but when we did, she also passed by it. I asked what the place was, and she did say it was their old nursery where the children come for classes. But it is now out of order because the building was slated for renovations. After the tour, I was introduced to the kids. They were all adorable and well behaved. In total, there were 32 orphans, all very bright and smiley. All, except for one. A little girl with no blue ribbon pin on her hat stood silently on the sides, staring at me. I couldn't catch her name, so I thought I would just talk to her later to lighten up her mood. Evening came and I was settling in my very own house. This was my first time having a place of my own while on volunteer work. Usually, I would be sleeping in a guest room, which was quite uncomfortable, given that my employers would be sleeping next door. After setting down my belongings, I went to the kitchen to make coffee. Like the old house designs, this one also had a window in front of the sink, and it gave me a view of the whole orphanage, especially the old nursery. Suddenly, I heard a knock on the door. I immediately went to see who it was. Jerry, a small boy about 2 feet tall, had really small sapphire eyes, a brown complexion, and golden hair. He lazily rubbed his fingers against his left eye as he said, "Pee-pee." I smiled at him as I carried him and went to the restrooms near the main building. From what I learned from the nuns earlier, Jerry does like to knock on caretakers' doors to accompany him to the toilet. He has his own restroom inside his room, but the nuns couldn't figure out why he opts to get out of his room instead. After helping him get back to his room, I noticed another kid wandering around the old nursery. I went there to get the kid back to the dorm. Just a few steps away from the nursery, I heard a little girl singing.
The bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London bridge is falling down, my fair lady.
I peered inside the nursery and found a little girl sitting on the floor, singing to a teddy bear as if she was lulling it to sleep.
London bridge is falling down, my fair lady.
You should be sleeping at this hour, I said. The little girl immediately stopped singing and stood up. She looked at me with a cold stare and smiled. "What's your name?" I asked. "Elizabeth," she replied. "Okay, Elizabeth, let's get you back to the dorm. You shouldn't be up at this hour." I reached out to her. She took my hand. It was icy cold. I also noticed how pale she was and how lifeless her eyes were. "I couldn't sleep," she suddenly said. "Is that so? Then try counting from 1 to 10 every time you close your eyes," I replied. After successfully bringing her back to the dorm, I went back to my house and finished my coffee. I called it a day and slept early despite having a double shot of espresso. That night, I dreamt of myself standing in the middle of a long hallway, listening to multiple nursery rhymes that echoed endlessly inside my head. I woke up feeling tired. My day as a volunteer finally started. It was quite tiring because the place was humongous with a total of 6 buildings. The main building, the children's dorms, the nuns' quarters, the new nursery, the greenhouse garden, the barn, and the playhouse. Fortunately, I was only tasked with taking care of the animals in the barn. Honestly, I still couldn't believe that they had their own barn. During lunch, we all ate together in the main building. I noticed Elizabeth sitting opposite where I was sitting at the other far end. She didn't have plates in front of her and didn't seem like she wanted to eat. She just stared down at the table with an unusual smile on her face. I thought maybe she finished eating earlier than everyone else, since the children here were being taught to take their dishes to the sink on their own after finishing their meal. The rest of my day was just looking after the animals again. I loved it because I wasn't really good around children, especially within long hours. Evening came again and I just had the same stuff happening, with me making coffee and Jerry knocking on my door. Fortunately, Elizabeth wasn't singing the old nursery again. I went to bed. I was awoken, however, when there was a loud bang against my door. I sat up on my bed and waited for another sound. Silence. And then,
Ring around a rosy bucket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, they all fall down.
I gasped as I heard Elizabeth's singing voice. I went out of my room and was about to go down when I saw Elizabeth standing by the end of the stairs, staring up at me, still singing with a smile.
Ring around the rosy bucket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, they all fall down.
Repeating the same line again and again. Elizabeth? I called out. How did you get in here? She finally stopped singing, and her smile slowly but surely turned into a frown. I trembled when she slowly extended her arm out to grab at the staircase's railing and ran up with her other hand also extended as if getting ready to grab me. I gasped awake. A dream? It was only a dream. Days passed by with the same routine. Jerry waking up and knocking on my door. Elizabeth somehow popping out of somewhere, singing a lullaby, either in my dreams or for real. Each time Elizabeth would sing a different song. One particular evening, Jerry did not knock on my door. I was making coffee like usual when I saw the little boy standing in front of the old nursery. He was rubbing his eyes like he usually does when he knocked on my door. When suddenly, he was yanked into the building by another kid. I immediately ran towards the nursery, and as I got closer, Elizabeth's voice grew louder and clearer.
Rock-a-bye, baby, on the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock.
I saw Elizabeth cradling Jerry while sitting on the floor when I got there. Jerry was fast asleep, and Elizabeth looked ahead at nothing, smiling with her eyes as lifeless and cold as ever. I immediately yanked Jerry into my arms, and Elizabeth stopped singing. She frowned at me as she stood up. I froze in place. After a few minutes of silence, Elizabeth walked out of the old nursery and went to the dorms by herself. Jerry woke up and groaned, complaining about going to the toilet. After that night, I haven't seen Elizabeth again for a few days. It was peaceful. And just like that, my volunteer work passed by smoothly. 2 more days before this work was finished, I was called by the orphanage's headmaster, who told me that I was free to go that night. A driver that works with the orphanage would be coming to fetch me so I wouldn't have problems with transportation. I spent my last day caring for the barn animals that I grew to love, and saying goodbye to the orphanage's children. Jerry said his goodbye last and whispered to me, "Is Elizabeth going with you?" Cold shivers ran down my spine. I nervously laughed at him and kissed him on his forehead. He extended his hands as if he wanted me to carry him. I cradled him and he laughed. Not towards me, but to something else that seemed to be above my head. Evening came, and I said goodbye to my beautiful quaint house and climbed into the vehicle. The children were still awake, and everyone waved goodbye to me. Elizabeth was nowhere in sight. As we traveled further away from the orphanage, my cell phone beeped continuously as it received hundreds of notifications. Among them was a voice message from Aliana. Her last words chilled me to the core. Do not talk to Elizabeth. She said Elizabeth was the reason why the kids in the orphanage had the blue ribbon pins on their hats, to make sure that visitors and newcomers would take notice that Elizabeth didn't have one on and would ask the nuns about the kid. I never asked the nuns about Elizabeth, didn't I? Are you okay? The bus driver's voice startled me. I looked up, catching a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. I gasped in horror as I saw Kid's body riding on my shoulders. The kid slowly hunched over, revealing long black hair. She tilted her head at a humanly impossible angle and looked at me through the rearview mirror. She smiled. Elizabeth?
Row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, merrily, merrily. Life is but a dream.
Everything after that was a blur. The driver lost control of the car and we swerved rather roughly towards a ditch. The next thing I knew was that my eyes were blasted with blinding light as I was wheeled in a hurry by nurses and doctors, and Elizabeth was still singing in the background.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word. I'm gonna buy you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird don't sing, then it would be nothing but a dead thing.
Years have passed ever since that incident. My volunteering days ended, and I lost my legs that fateful and cursed evening. Thank you for listening. If you are interested in these kinds of stuff, feel free to like, follow, subscribe, or leave a comment down below. And if you have creepy stories you want to share, send them to ghastlycollection@gmail.com. Until next time, take care and stay frightened.